They came for his throat on a Tuesday. 3 dukes, 7 lords, 40 armed men riding through freezing rain toward the northern fortress that had swallowed every army foolish enough to test its walls. Duke Lucy N. Blackthorn stood at the edge of his tower balcony, watching their torches flicker against the dark like dying stars. And he felt nothing. Not anger, not fear. Just the cold mathematics of consequence. Because every man riding toward Ravenshade tonight had miscalculated the same thing. They believed isolation meant vulnerability. They confused silence with weakness. And by morning, every single one of them would understand exactly how wrong they were. What happens next will prove why some men are feared, and others merely remembered. The delegation arrived at the iron gates of Ravenshade Castle just before midnight, their horses steaming in the bitter coastal wind. Rain hammered the flagstones in sheets so thick the torchlight barely cut through. The lead rider, a thick-necked lord named Hargrove, dismounted with the theatrical confidence of a man who believed numbers guaranteed outcomes. Lucian made them wait 40 minutes in the courtyard, not because he needed time, because waiting corrodes certainty the way salt corrodes iron. Slowly, completely. And by the time the guards finally opened the great doors to the receiving hall, Hargrove's confidence had already begun to fracture at the edges. The hall was deliberately underlit. 3 chandeliers burned where normally 12 would blaze. Shadows pooled in the corners and climbed the walls like something alive. Lucian sat in a high-backed chair at the far end of the room, one leg crossed over the other, his black coat unbuttoned at the collar. He did not stand when they entered. He did not greet them. He simply watched, the way a man watches weather approaching from a distance, already knowing what it will bring. Hargrove stopped 15 feet from the chair and cleared his throat. The sound echoed off stone walls that had absorbed 4 centuries of similar performances. Your Grace, we come representing the coalition of Eastern Lords. We bring terms. Terms. Lucien repeated the word like he was tasting something he might spit out. You ride 40 men through my territory uninvited, arrive at my gates past midnight, and you call whatever this is terms. The coalition has concerns regarding your expansion into the southern trade corridors. The tariffs you've imposed are strangling commerce in 3 provinces. We've come to negotiate a resolution. You've come to threaten me, Hargrove. Let's not dress it up. The lord stiffened. Behind him, the other nobles shifted on their feet. The armed guards positioned along the walls remained motionless, but their presence tightened the room like a tourniquet. The coalition represents considerable power, Your Grace. 37 noble houses, 14 merchant guilds. We control 60% of the kingdom's eastern grain supply. 62%, Lucien corrected without inflection. Your numbers are outdated. Lord Ashwick sold his reserves to my agents 3 days ago. You're down to 51% and falling. The silence that followed had weight, physical, crushing weight. Hargrove's jaw worked, but nothing came out. The man standing to his left, a younger lord with sharp features and nervous hands, stepped forward. We didn't come here to be humiliated. Then you chose the wrong castle. Lucien uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The movement was small, but it shifted the gravity of the entire room toward him. Every eye locked, every breath held. I know what this coalition is. I know who funds it. I know which lords joined out of conviction and which ones joined because they owed gambling debts to the wrong people. I know that Duke Aldrich Voss proposed this alliance 6 months ago in a private room at the Gilded Swan, and I know he did it after his mistress told him I'd denied his petition for expanded mining rights. He paused. Let the words settle into bone. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to ride back to your coalition and deliver a message. The tariffs stay. The trade corridors remain under Ravenshade authority, and any noble house that attempts to circumvent my regulations will find its assets frozen, its debts called in, and its reputation destroyed before the next harvest. Hargrove's face had gone the color of wet cement. You can't threaten 37 houses. I'm not threatening anyone. Lucien stood. At full height, he was taller than every man in the room, and the shadows seemed to gather around him like an honor guard. I'm informing you. There's a difference. Threats require uncertainty about follow-through. I have none. He turned his back on them and walked toward the side door. A calculated insult. Turning your back on armed men was either suicidal or a declaration that they posed no danger worth acknowledging. Your Grace, Hargrove's voice cracked slightly. The coalition will not accept this. Lucien stopped at the door but did not turn around. Then the coalition will cease to exist, one way or another. He walked through the door and closed it behind him with a sound that carried the finality of a coffin lid. In the private corridor beyond the receiving hall, Lucien's composure held for exactly 12 steps before the pressure in his chest became something he had to acknowledge. He pressed one hand against the stone wall and breathed, controlled, measured. The kind of breathing a man learns when showing weakness means annihilation. His steward, Marcus Hale, appeared from the shadows with the silent efficiency of someone who had served Lucien for 19 years and survived every purge, every crisis, every midnight reckoning that came with proximity to power. They'll leave within the hour. I've had their horses fed and their rooms left unprepared. Smart. Your father's technique. My father would have had them arrested at the gate. Lucien pushed off the wall and straightened his coat. Send riders to Ashwick's estate. Confirm the grain reserves are secured and moved to our warehouses by week's end. And get me the updated intelligence on Aldrich Voss. Everything. Finances, alliances, vulnerabilities. Marcus nodded. There's another matter. There always is. A petition arrived this afternoon from the Crown Court. A Lady Seraphina Vale has requested formal protection under the Duchy of Ravenshade. Lucien frowned. The name meant something, but the association was buried under layers of more pressing information. Vale, the disgraced family. Lord Edmund Vale's daughter. The father died 8 months ago. Debts consumed the estate. The vultures moved in immediately. She's been fighting legal battles against 3 noble houses trying to seize what remains of her family's holdings. And she chose Ravenshade for protection. She chose the only duchy powerful enough that the vultures might actually back off. Something in Marcus's tone made Lucien pause. You've met her. She arrived at court 3 days ago, requested an audience through proper channels. When the court clerk tried to bury her petition under procedural delays, she walked directly into the Minister of Commerce's office and presented a legal brief that apparently made his senior counsel look like first-year students. Lucien's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. Intelligence was a commodity rarer than gold in aristocratic circles, where bloodline and brutality passed for qualifications. Grant the audience, tomorrow, council session. She requested a private meeting. I don't do private meetings with petitioners. She comes to council, or she doesn't come at all. Marcus hesitated. A tell so slight that anyone else would have missed it. She won't be easy to manage, Your Grace. Good. Easy people are useless. The council chamber of Ravenshade occupied the second floor of the castle's east wing, a cavernous room with vaulted ceilings and narrow windows that admitted light like a miser counting coins. The long table at its center seated 24, though Lucien rarely allowed more than 12 to attend any given session. Information was leverage, and the fewer people who possessed it, the more it was worth. When Lady Seraphina Vale entered, the room changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but the air itself seemed to rearrange, the way atmosphere shifts before a storm announces itself. She was tall for a woman of noble birth, with dark hair pulled back from sharp features that carried the architecture of old aristocracy. She wore black, simple, and severe. No jewelry except a signet ring bearing the Vale family crest, a deliberate statement. Mourning and defiance compressed into a single outfit. She walked the length of the room without hesitation, without the performative humility that most petitioners displayed when entering the Duke's presence. Her stride was measured, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on Lucien with an intensity that several council members found uncomfortable enough to look away. Lord Chancellor Graves, a thin man with a voice like old parchment, gestured to the chair reserved for petitioners. It sat lower than every other chair in the room, another of Lucien's deliberate arrangements. Seraphina looked at the chair, looked at Graves, then pulled a standard chair from the table's edge, placed it at the proper height, and sat down. The silence was deafening. Lucien watched from the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Something moved behind his eyes, too fast to name. Lady Vale. Graves recovered first, his tone carrying the precise calibration of institutional displeasure. Protocol requires that petitioners be heard. The height of my chair has no bearing on the validity of my claim. Graves looked at Lucien. Lucien said nothing. The Chancellor swallowed whatever reprimand he had been preparing and gestured for her to continue. Serafina opened a leather folio and placed 3 documents on the table with the precision of someone laying cards in a game she fully intended to win. 8 months ago, my father, Lord Edmund Vale, died of a wasting illness that consumed his health over 2 years. During those 2 years, 3 noble houses, Marchetti, Wyndham, and Carstairs, initiated legal proceedings to seize Vale family holdings, citing debts they claim my father owed. I have evidence that 2 of those debts are fabricated, and the 3rd was repaid in full 17 months before my father's death. She slid the first document toward the center of the table. This is a notarized copy of the repayment ledger for the Carstairs debt, complete with the receiving clerk's signature and the bank's confirmation seal. The second document followed. This is testimony from a former clerk in Lord Marchetti's household confirming that the debt instrument bearing my father's name was created after his death. The signature is forged. The third document landed with a sound that seemed heavier than paper should produce. And this is a letter from the Wyndham estate's own solicitor, obtained through legal discovery, advising Lord Wyndham that the claim against my family was, in his words, legally indefensible but politically advantageous. She folded her hands on the table and looked directly at Lucien. I am not here to beg for mercy, Your Grace. I am here to demonstrate that 3 of the kingdom's noble houses have conspired to strip my family of everything we've built over 6 generations. I am requesting the protection of Ravenshade not as charity, but as justice. The council members exchanged glances. Several of them had financial ties to the houses she had just accused. The tension in the room became something you could almost hear, a high-pitched frequency just below the threshold of sound. Lucien studied her for a long moment. The way she held herself, the way she had entered his domain and immediately refused to play by its rules. The precision of her evidence, laid out not as a plea, but as a prosecution. Justice, he said finally, is a word people use when they want something and lack the power to take it. The response was designed to provoke, to crack whatever composure she had built and reveal the desperation underneath. Serafina didn't flinch. And power is a word people use when they want something and lack the justice to deserve it. The room stopped breathing. No one spoke to Lucien Blackthorne like that. Not lords, not dukes, not men with armies at their backs, and generations of bloodline behind their titles. And certainly not a petitioner sitting in a chair she had repositioned without permission. Lucien felt something shift inside his chest, not anger, something more dangerous. The recognition of an equal intellect wielded without apology. The understanding that this woman had walked into the most dangerous room in the kingdom and chosen to fight instead of kneel. Every instinct he had cultivated over 2 decades of ruthless governance told him to crush the challenge, to reassert dominance, to make an example. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of weapon. Leave the documents. The council will review them. The council will do nothing. Her voice carried no anger, only certainty. Half the men at this table have financial relationships with the houses I've accused. Any review they conduct will be structured to protect their own interests. Lord Graves turned crimson. You dare impugn the integrity of this council. I dare state what everyone in this room already knows. She turned to Graves with an expression of calm so absolute it was more devastating than any accusation. Your nephew married into the Wyndham family last spring. Lord Ashford's shipping company holds exclusive contracts with Marchetti trading houses, and Sir Pemberton has been Carstairs' legal counsel for the past 11 years. She looked back at Lucien. I'm not impugning integrity, Lord Chancellor. I'm observing its absence. Lucien's lips did not smile, but something behind his eyes moved. A flicker. A spark in darkness. What exactly are you proposing, Lady Vale? A direct ruling, from you, based on the evidence, without the theater of a compromised review process. You want me to override my own counsel. I want you to do what you were going to do anyway. The only question is whether you do it now, with transparency, or later, after a performative delay designed to preserve the illusion of deliberation. The room was no longer silent. It was paralyzed. Council members stared at Serafina with expressions ranging from outrage to barely concealed admiration. This woman had not merely petitioned the Duke, she had dissected his entire governance apparatus in real time and laid the machinery bare. Lucien stood. The chair scraped against stone, and the sound cut through the paralysis like a blade. "The council session is adjourned. Lady Vale, remain." The room emptied with the controlled urgency of men who understood that proximity to conflict was a liability. Doors opened and closed, footsteps retreated. Within 2 minutes, only Lucien and Serafina remained, separated by the length of the table and something far more volatile than furniture. Lucien walked slowly along the table's edge, his fingers trailing across the polished wood. He stopped 6 feet from her chair and looked down. Not with contempt. With the focused intensity of a man who had just discovered something unexpected in terrain he believed he had mapped completely. "You rehearsed that." "I prepared it. There's a difference." "The difference being?" "Rehearsal implies performance. Preparation implies competence." He studied her face, searching for cracks, for the trembling hands or racing pulse that would betray the fear she had to be feeling. He found nothing but clarity. "You've just publicly accused 3 noble houses of fraud and half my council of corruption. In my own chamber. Do you understand the position you've put yourself in?" "I understand the position I was already in. 3 powerful families conspiring to destroy what remains of mine. The only change is that I've chosen to fight instead of disappear quietly." "Most people in your situation would have sought protection from the crown. The crown takes months to act and years to resolve. By then, there would be nothing left to protect. So you came to the one man in the kingdom who operates faster than the system he exists within. I came to the one man in the kingdom who might actually value competence over convenience." Lucien absorbed that. Competence. Not loyalty, not flattery, not the desperate gratitude he was accustomed to receiving from those who sought his protection. She had offered him something far more rare, an honest assessment of his own nature, delivered without fear. The feeling in his chest intensified. He recognized it now, though he would never have admitted it aloud. It was the specific hunger of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who were either afraid of him or trying to use him, suddenly standing across from someone who appeared to be neither. "I'll review the evidence personally," he said. "If it holds, Ravenshade protection will be extended to the Vale estate. Your enemies will be dealt with. And in return?" The question stopped him. Petitioners did not ask about the price. They accepted whatever terms were imposed and counted themselves fortunate. "You assume there's a price?" "Everything in your world has a price, Your Grace. The only question is whether it's stated openly or collected later in the dark." Lucien felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not a smile. Something more private than that. "Stay at court. Attend the Crown Council sessions next week. Let me see whether your competence extends beyond document preparation." "That's not a price. That's an audition. Call it whatever you want. The result is the same." She stood, gathered her folio, and met his gaze one final time. "I'll attend, but understand something clearly, Your Grace. I came here for protection, not ownership. Whatever arrangement we reach, I am not a piece to be moved on someone else's board." She walked out of the council chamber with the same measured stride she had entered with. No rush, no backward glance, no concession to the enormity of what she had just done. Lucien watched the door close behind her and stood motionless for a long time. Marcus appeared from the side entrance, having observed the entire exchange from behind a partition. He waited. Lucien did not speak for nearly a minute. "Find out everything about her," Lucien said finally. "Everything she's done since her father died. Every alliance she's attempted. Every door that was closed in her face. Every person who helped her, and every person who refused." "You're considering granting the protection." "I granted it the moment she moved the chair." Marcus absorbed this without expression. 19 years of service had taught him to recognize the rare moments when Lucien's decisions bypassed calculation and entered territory that was entirely more dangerous. "She's not wrong about the council, Your Grace. If you rule in her favor, Marchetti and Wyndham will retaliate. Combined with the coalition's pressure from the east, I know exactly what it means. Then you're deliberately opening a second front. Lucian turned from the door and looked at his steward with eyes that held something Marcus had never seen before. Not doubt, not hesitation, something closer to anticipation. Every empire that ever collapsed did so because it stopped expanding. The moment you defend instead of attack, you've already started losing. Hargrove's coalition is a symptom. The vultures circling the Vale estate are a symptom. The disease is stagnation, and the only cure is to become so dangerous that attacking you costs more than coexistence. And Lady Vale? Lady Vale is the most intelligent person to walk into this castle in 20 years. That makes her either the most valuable asset in the kingdom or the most dangerous threat. Which do you believe she is? Lucian walked toward the window where gray morning light was beginning to dissolve the darkness beyond the thick glass. Below, the courtyard was coming alive with the movements of servants, guards, and merchants beginning another day under the shadow of Ravenshade. Both, he said quietly, and that's exactly what makes this interesting. 3 days later, the Crown Council convened in the capital's Grand Assembly Hall, a baroque monument to monarchical excess where every surface gleamed with gilded excess and the air smelled perpetually of beeswax and old money. Serafina arrived early. She had spent the previous 2 days studying every active legislative matter before the council, memorizing the positions of key ministers, and mapping the political alliances that determined which proposals survived and which were quietly strangled in committee. What she had not done was sleep. The dreams had started again. Her father's face in the final weeks, hollowed and gray, his voice reduced to a whisper that carried more weight than any shout. Remember who we are. Remember what they took. The dreams always ended the same way, with her standing alone in the empty halls of the Vale estate, surrounded by the echoes of a family that no longer existed. She pushed the memories down and entered the assembly hall with the composure of someone who had learned that vulnerability was a currency she could not afford to spend. The hall was already crowded. Ministers clustered in conversational knots, their voices carrying the practiced warmth of men who would stab each other before dinner if the incentives aligned. Serafina recognized several faces from her research. The Minister of Commerce, Lord Pembroke, a rotund man whose cheerful demeanor concealed a ruthless instinct for self-preservation. Lady Harrington, the only woman currently holding a senior advisory position, whose survival in the male-dominated council was itself a masterclass in political navigation. Sir Edwin Thorne, the Crown's military advisor, whose loyalty to the monarch was legendary and whose distrust of Lucien Blackthorne was barely concealed. And in the far corner of the hall, standing alone near a window as if the crowd existed in a different dimension, Lucien himself. He wore midnight blue today, dark enough to read as black from a distance, but distinct enough to signal that his presence at the Crown Council was deliberate, not dutiful. His posture radiated the particular stillness of a predator in unfamiliar territory, alert to every movement, calculating every angle. Their eyes met across the hall. Neither looked away. The council session began with routine business: trade disputes, border petitions, agricultural reports that made half the assembly struggle to stay awake. Serafina sat in the public gallery, observing, cataloging, building a mental architecture of who owed what to whom and where the fault lines ran. 2 hours in, the session shifted. Lord Pembroke stood and introduced a new regulatory proposal that would restructure taxation in the northern trade corridors. The language was dense, the implications buried under layers of bureaucratic abstraction, but Serafina recognized it instantly for what it was: an attack on Ravenshade's economic infrastructure. The proposal would cap tariff rates in corridors that Lucien currently controlled, effectively slashing his revenue by 30%, and redistributing the income to southern provinces whose lords happened to be Pembroke's closest allies. Lucien's expression did not change. He sat perfectly still, watching Pembroke present the proposal with the enthusiasm of a man who believed his political cover was ironclad. When the floor opened for comment, 3 ministers immediately voiced support. Then 2 more. The momentum was building with the orchestrated precision of a campaign that had been planned months in advance. Serafina felt her pulse accelerate. She understood what was happening. This was the coalition's real strategy: Not the theatrical midnight ride to Ravenshade, but a legislative ambush designed to strip Lucien's power through institutional channels where military strength was irrelevant. Before she could calculate the implications, she heard her own voice cutting through the assembly hall. The proposal contains a structural contradiction. Every head in the room turned. Serafina stood in the public gallery, her voice carrying with a clarity that silenced the murmuring crowd. She was not supposed to speak. The public gallery was observational. Petitioners had no standing to address the council directly. Lord Graves, serving as session moderator, looked at her with undisguised hostility. The gallery does not have the floor. Then the floor should be grateful for the interruption. She did not sit down. Section 14 of the proposal references the Northern Maritime Commerce Act of 1847 as the legal basis for restructuring tariff authority. That act was superseded by the Trade Consolidation Amendment of 1862, which explicitly grants ducal authority over corridor taxation in perpetuity. The proposal isn't just economically questionable, it's legally void. The hall erupted. Ministers turned to legal advisors. Legal advisors turned to each other. Pembroke's face underwent a transformation from confident to confused to furious in the space of 5 seconds. Furthermore, Serafina continued, raising her voice above the commotion, the redistribution formula in Section 22 allocates 43% of redirected revenue to 3 specific provinces. Those provinces are represented by lords who co-signed the original coalition petition against Ravenshade last month. This isn't economic reform, it's political retaliation dressed in legislative language. The silence that followed was not the calculated kind Lucien wielded like a weapon. This was the stunned silence of an institution that had just been publicly dismantled by someone it had not even recognized as a threat. Lucien watched from across the hall. His expression remained carved from stone, but his eyes burned with something that defied every classification his disciplined mind attempted to impose. This woman had just saved his economic empire with a legal citation and the audacity to speak when every rule said she should remain silent. Lord Graves banged his gavel. This is highly irregular. The gallery will observe silence or be cleared. Then clear the gallery. The legal contradiction will still exist whether I'm sitting here or standing outside. The session dissolved into chaos. Pembroke demanded a recess. Ministers argued in clusters. Legal advisors scrambled through documents. The proposal, which had seemed unstoppable 20 minutes ago, was hemorrhaging credibility with every passing second. Lucien stood and left the hall without speaking to anyone. He did not need to. Serafina had just declared war on half the kingdom's power structure, in his name, without his permission, and with a precision that made every political strategist in the room look like an amateur. That evening, a sealed envelope arrived at Serafina's modest quarters in the capital's diplomatic district. Inside was a single card bearing the Ravenshade crest, and 6 words written in ink so dark it looked like it had been drawn from the bottom of the sea. You are summoned, midnight, East Tower. No signature. None was needed. Serafina held the card for a long time, standing at the window where lamplight threw her shadow against the wall like a second self. She understood what the summons meant. She had crossed a line today that could not be uncrossed. She had intervened in the Duke's political battle without authorization, and in doing so, she had bound her fate to his in ways that no legal petition could have accomplished. She dressed in black. She always dressed in black now, not because mourning demanded it, but because black was the color of something that had stopped apologizing. The East Tower of Ravenshade's capital residence rose above the surrounding buildings like a dark finger pointing at something in the sky that only the powerful were allowed to see. The guards at the base recognized her and stepped aside without a word. She climbed the spiral staircase alone, her footsteps echoing against stone that had witnessed centuries of secret meetings, desperate bargains, and decisions that shaped the fates of thousands. The top floor was a single circular room with windows on every side. The city sprawled below in a constellation of lamplight and shadow, and above, clouds moved across the moon like slow-motion curtains being drawn across a stage. Lucien stood at the window facing east, his coat removed, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. It was the most informal she had ever seen him, and somehow the casualness made him more imposing, not less. as though the armor of formality had been concealing something rawer underneath. He did not turn when she entered. "You know what you did today?" It was not a question. "I identified a legal flaw in a hostile proposal." "You painted a target on your back the size of the Capitol building." "The target was already there. Today I chose to face it instead of pretending it didn't exist." He turned then. In the lamplight, his features were sharper, stripped of the controlled neutrality he maintained in public. His eyes held the intensity of a man who had been thinking about one thing for hours and had reached a conclusion he did not entirely welcome. "Pembroke will destroy you for this. He has allies in every ministry. Your petition for protection is still pending, which means legally you're still exposed." "Then rule on the petition." "I'm considering something else entirely." The words landed between them like a blade driven into a table. Serafina felt her composure tighten, not breaking but adjusting, the way a bridge adjusts under weight it was designed to bear but has never actually carried. "What exactly are you considering, Your Grace?" Lucian crossed the room toward her, not quickly, not aggressively, with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that every step was a declaration. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the thin scar along his jawline and the faint shadows under his eyes that spoke of nights spent calculating instead of sleeping. "I'm considering the possibility that you are the most dangerous person to walk into my life. And I'm considering the fact that instead of neutralizing that danger, every instinct I possess is telling me to bring you closer." Serafina held his gaze without flinching. "That sounds like a vulnerability, not a strategy." "It's both, and that's what terrifies me." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded in a way that neither of them had expected. Lucian Blackthorne did not confess to fear. He weaponized it in others. He exploited it. He had built an empire on the precise understanding that fear was the only currency that never inflated. And yet, here he stood, telling a woman he barely knew that she had breached walls no army had ever reached. Before either of them could speak again, the door at the base of the tower crashed open. Footsteps. Fast. Urgent. Multiple sets pounding up the spiral staircase with the desperate rhythm of men carrying catastrophic news. Marcus Hale burst through the upper door, his face white, his composure shattered for the first time in 19 years of service. "Your Grace, riders from the eastern border. Duke Aldrich Voss has mobilized his forces, 3,000 men marching toward the Ravenshade corridor." Lucian's expression went cold. Not gradually, instantly, like watching a lake freeze in a single heartbeat. "There's more." Marcus could barely get the words out. "The Crown's military advisor, Sir Edwin Thorne, has formally accused you of economic treason before the Royal Assembly. The Crown has issued a warrant for the seizure of Ravenshade's northern assets." He swallowed. "And Lord Marchetti has filed an emergency petition to have Lady Vale arrested for sedition based on her interference in today's council session." The room contracted around them. 3 attacks, 3 different angles, military, institutional, and personal. Launched simultaneously with the coordination of a conspiracy that had been building for far longer than anyone had suspected. Lucian stood perfectly still. The lamplight cast his shadow across the floor like a stain. Serafina felt the blood drain from her face, but her voice emerged steady. They were waiting. Today's council session wasn't just Pembroke's ambush. It was the trigger. My intervention gave them the excuse they needed to move. Lucian looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her stomach drop into frozen emptiness. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. The recognition of a man who had just realized that the trap he had been watching was not the trap he was standing in. Lucian moved before the last syllable of Marcus's report finished echoing off the tower walls. Not toward the door. Toward the desk in the corner where a map of the kingdom lay pinned under brass weights, its surface scarred with ink annotations and tactical markings that told the story of a man who had been preparing for war long before war came knocking. He planted both hands on the map and leaned forward, his shoulders drawing tight beneath his shirt. 3 seconds of silence. 4. 5. Serafina watched the muscles along his jaw contract and release in a rhythm that had nothing to do with speech, and everything to do with a mind processing catastrophic information at a speed most men could not sustain. Timeline, he said. Marcus stepped closer. Voss's forces were spotted crossing the Ashenmere Bridge at sundown. At forced march, they reached the Ravenshade corridor in 4 days. The Crown warrant was filed 2 hours ago. Marchetti's petition against Lady Vale hits the Royal Magistrate's desk at first light. Who signed the warrant? Sir Edwin Thorne presented the charges, but the signature belongs to Lord High Chancellor Beaumont. Lucien's head came up. Something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation so rapid it was almost physical. Beaumont was the Crown's highest legal authority. His signature on a seizure warrant meant the conspiracy had penetrated the monarchy's inner circle, or the monarchy itself had decided that Ravenshade had become more dangerous than useful. Either possibility was survivable. Both together were not. Get Graves out of bed. I want the full council assembled in 1 hour, not the Crown Council, mine. At this hour, they'll resist. Then remind them what happens to people who resist me. Marcus left without another word. His footsteps descended the spiral staircase at a pace that betrayed urgency his face had tried to conceal. Serafina stood near the window, her reflection ghosting across the dark glass. The city below continued its nighttime rhythms, oblivious to the fact that the power structure governing its existence had just cracked along 3 fault lines simultaneously. You should leave the capital tonight. Lucien did not look up from the map. Marchetti's petition gives any magistrate with ambition a legal excuse to detain you. Once you're in custody, the process will grind you into nothing. That's how institutional weapons work. They don't need to prove guilt. They just need to consume time until the target runs out of resources. And go where? Ravenshade. The fortress. My authority is absolute within the duchy's borders. No crown warrant reaches inside those walls without my permission. You're asking me to put myself entirely inside your power. Now he looked up. The lamplight caught his face at an angle that stripped away every layer of political calculation and left something underneath that was harder to read. Rawer. I'm asking you to survive. The philosophical objections can wait until you're not facing a prison cell. Serafina crossed the room and stood across the map from him. Their eyes met over a terrain of illustrated mountains, rivers, and territorial boundaries that suddenly felt less like geography and more like a diagram of everything that stood between them. If I go to Ravenshade, I become your leverage. A disgraced noblewoman sheltered by the Duke the Crown just accused of treason. They'll use me against you. They'll try. And you've calculated that the benefit of having me inside your walls outweighs the political cost. I've calculated that letting you get arrested serves no one except the people trying to destroy both of us. She studied his face, searching for the manipulation, the hidden angle, the transactional machinery she knew had to be operating somewhere beneath the surface. What do you actually want from me, Lucien? It was the first time she had used his name without the title attached. The intimacy of it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, circles expanding outward, touching everything. He straightened, drew a breath that was almost controlled. Almost. Right now I want you alive and free. Everything else is a conversation for when the world isn't actively trying to collapse. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded once and walked toward the door. I'll need 30 minutes to gather my documents. You have 20. My riders leave in 25. She disappeared down the staircase and Lucien stood alone in the tower room with the map spread before him like a patient on an operating table. He pressed his thumb against the point marking Ravenshade and felt the paper give slightly under the pressure. Survival had always been his native language. The grammar of threat assessment, resource allocation, and preemptive violence was as natural to him as breathing. But something had entered the equation tonight that his usual calculus could not accommodate. The look in Serafina's eyes when she had used his name. Not trust, not surrender. Something more dangerous than either. The recognition of a person who had decided to bet everything on a man she did not yet fully understand. That kind of faith demanded something in return, and Lucien was not entirely certain he possessed whatever it was. The council assembled in the castle's underground war room, a vaulted stone chamber beneath the east wing that had been designed 3 centuries ago for exactly this kind of crisis. No windows. One entrance. Walls thick enough to swallow sound before it reached the corridor above. 12 men sat around a rectangular table lit by oil lamps that threw shadows across faces drawn tight with interrupted sleep and poorly concealed fear. Lord Chancellor Graves occupied his usual position to Lucien's right, his thin frame wrapped in a hastily donned coat, his eyes sharp despite the hour. General Aldous Kane, commander of Ravenshade's military forces, sat at the opposite end with the rigid posture of a man who had been awake for 36 hours and would remain awake for 36 more if required. Lucien entered the room and did not sit. He stood at the head of the table, placed both fists on the surface, and spoke without preamble. Aldrich Voss has 3,000 men 4 days from our western corridor. The Crown has issued a seizure warrant against our northern assets based on fabricated treason charges. And Lord Marchetti is attempting to weaponize the legal system against an individual under my protection. I want solutions, not commentary. Start. General Kane spoke first. 3,000 is a significant force, but Voss is marching through the Ashenmere Valley. The terrain funnels his column into a 2-mile corridor between the ridgeline and the river. If I position our cavalry on the heights and block the eastern exit, he's trapped. How many men do you need? 1,200, plus the garrison reserves from Blackmore Pass. You'll have 1,500. Take Blackmore's reserves and every mounted unit in the Northern Command. Lucien turned to Graves. The Crown warrant. How fast can it be challenged? Graves rubbed his temples with fingers that trembled slightly. Beaumont's signature gives it extraordinary authority. A direct legal challenge would take weeks. But there's a procedural vulnerability. The warrant references economic treason under the Consolidated Trade Statutes. Those statutes require a formal audit before seizure can be executed. The audit alone takes 14 days minimum. Buy me those 14 days. File every procedural objection in the legal code. Bury them in paperwork. I don't care if it's frivolous. I care that it's slow. Beaumont will see through it immediately. Of course he will. But he'll still have to respond to each filing individually. That's the beauty of bureaucracy. Even the people who built it can be strangled by it. Lord Ashford, the council's financial advisor, leaned forward. His round face glistened with nervous perspiration. Your Grace, the timing of these attacks is not coincidental. Someone coordinated this. Voss's military mobilization, Thorne's legal assault, Marchetti's petition. They were launched within hours of each other. This is a single operation with 3 arms. Obviously. Which means there's a central architect, someone pulling the strings. Also obvious. The question is who? Pembroke. The name came from the far end of the table, spoken by Sir Hadley Crane, Ravenshade's intelligence chief. A quiet man with unremarkable features and eyes that missed nothing. The tariff proposal he introduced today was never meant to pass. It was designed to provoke a reaction that could be used as justification for the legal assault. Lady Vale's intervention accelerated the timeline, but the machinery was already in motion. Pembroke doesn't have the resources to coordinate a military mobilization, Kane objected. He's a bureaucrat. Voss's army doesn't march on the say-so of a commerce minister. It does if the commerce minister is acting as the front for someone with far more authority. Crane pulled a folded document from his coat and placed it on the table. 3 weeks ago, one of my operatives intercepted a coded message between Pembroke's office and an unknown party using diplomatic encryption. I've been working on breaking the cipher. As of tonight, I have partial decryption. He unfolded the document. The table leaned in. The message references something called the Covenant, capital C. It discusses operational phases. Phase 1 is described as economic isolation. Phase 2 is institutional delegitimization. Phase 3 is, he paused, physical resolution. The room went cold. Physical resolution. A euphemism so thin it was practically transparent. Assassination. Not of a policy or a position, but of a person. Lucien absorbed the information the way a furnace absorbs fuel. Completely. Without remainder. His expression did not change, but something behind it locked into place with the finality of a vault door closing. The Covenant, he repeated. How many members? Unknown, but the encryption level suggests involvement at the highest tiers of government. This isn't a coalition of angry nobles. This is an organized conspiracy with access to crown resources. Beaumont? Possibly. The Lord Chancellor has the authority to issue warrants, access diplomatic channels, and mobilize institutional mechanisms, but I don't have confirmation yet. Get it. Your Grace, If Beaumont is involved, this extends to the crown itself. We may be looking at a sanctioned operation. I understand what we may be looking at. The silence that followed carried the weight of implications no one wanted to articulate. If the crown itself had authorized the destruction of Ravenshade, then Lucian was not fighting a political battle. He was fighting for survival against the entire apparatus of the state. Lucian straightened and looked at each man around the table. Some met his eyes. Others looked at the table, the walls, the oil lamps, anywhere that did not require acknowledging the magnitude of what they were facing. Here's what we're going to do. Kane, mobilize your forces tonight. I want cavalry on the Ashenmere Heights before Voss clears the valley entrance. Graves, begin the legal counteroffensive at first light. Ashford, activate every financial contingency we have. Freeze our assets before they can be seized. Move reserves to the offshore accounts in the maritime territories. He turned to Crane. I want that cipher fully broken within 48 hours. And I want the identity of every member of this covenant. Every name, every connection, every vulnerability. And if the trail leads to the crown? Lucien let the question hang for exactly long enough to make every man in the room understand that the answer was not theoretical. Then the crown becomes another obstacle to be dealt with. Dawn broke over the capital in shades of iron and ash. The sky refused to commit to color, as though even the weather understood that something fundamental had shifted during the night, and cheerfulness would be inappropriate. Seraphina's carriage departed at first light, flanked by 6 Ravenshade riders in dark coats carrying weapons that were technically prohibited within the capital's walls. No one stopped them. The guards at the eastern gate saw the Ravenshade crest and suddenly discovered urgent paperwork that required their attention elsewhere. Inside the carriage, Seraphina sat with her document folio on her lap and watched the capital recede through the rear window. The city that had been her battleground for 3 months was shrinking into a collection of rooftops and spires. And with every mile of distance, she felt the strange paradox of simultaneously running towards safety and deeper into danger. She was placing herself entirely within the power of a man whose reputation was built on the principle that everything within his reach belonged to him. A man whose eyes, in the tower room last night, had contained something she had not expected to find. Not calculation, not possession, need. The raw, unprocessed need of a man who had spent his entire life acquiring things and had never learned how to simply ask for them. The carriage rattled over a bridge spanning the River Ash, and Seraphina closed her eyes. She thought about her father, about the estate, about the 6 generations of Vale history that had been reduced to legal briefs and contested debts. She thought about the moment in the council chamber when she had moved the chair, a gesture so small and so absolute that it had altered the trajectory of her entire existence. She had not planned it. She had simply refused, in that single instant, to be diminished. And the consequence of that refusal was that she was now riding toward a fortress ruled by the most dangerous man in the kingdom, carrying nothing but her intelligence, her evidence, and the terrifying suspicion that she understood Lucian Blackthorne better than he understood himself. Back in the capital, the morning brought escalation. Lord Marchetti's petition reached the royal magistrate at precisely 8 o'clock. By 9, a formal summons had been issued for Lady Seraphina Vale. By 10, when court officers arrived at her quarters and found them empty, the political temperature in the capital increased by several degrees. Marchetti was furious. A compact, meticulous man with small hands and smaller patience, he had built his career on the principle that institutional machinery, properly weaponized, was more lethal than any army. The Vale woman's disappearance from the capital meant she had been warned, which meant Blackthorne was already countermaneuvering, which meant the timeline had to accelerate. He stood in his private study at the Marchetti townhouse, facing 3 men whose names would never appear in any official document. She's heading to Ravenshade. Obviously. Then we use it. The Duke is sheltering a woman accused of sedition. That's obstruction of crown justice. Add it to Thorne's treason charges. Stack enough accusations and even Blackthorne's legal defenses collapse under sheer volume. The tallest of the 3 men, a thin figure with eyes the color of wet stone, spoke carefully. The Covenant's timeline calls for Phase 2 to complete before physical resolution begins. If we accelerate, the timeline is already compromised. Vale's intervention in the council session exposed the tariff proposal 3 months ahead of schedule. We adapt or we fail. Pembroke won't be happy. Pembroke answers to me, not the other way around. Marchetti turned to the window. Outside, the capital was waking to another day of politics, commerce, and carefully maintained illusions. Somewhere to the north, a carriage carrying a woman with inconvenient intelligence was rolling toward a fortress commanded by a man who had proven, repeatedly, that conventional approaches to his destruction did not work. Contact Voss. Tell him to accelerate the march. I want his forces at the Ravenshade corridor in 3 days, not 4. His men are already pushed, then push them harder. By the time Blackthorn's council finishes their legal maneuvering, I want a military reality on the ground that makes courtroom arguments irrelevant. He picked up a pen and began writing a message in the cipher that only Covenant members could read. Each stroke was precise, unhurried, composed. The handwriting of a man who had been planning the destruction of Lucien Blackthorn for years and was now watching those plans approach their culmination. And one more thing. He did not look up from the paper. I want someone inside Ravenshade. Not a spy, not an informant, a weapon, someone already embedded, someone Blackthorn trusts. The silence that followed carried the particular quality of men who understood exactly what was being asked and were already calculating the price. There's someone, the thin man said, inside the Duke's household, close to his operations. The asset has been dormant for 2 years, waiting for activation. Marchetti's pen stopped. He looked up. Activate them. Acham. The road to Ravenshade cut through 400 miles of northern landscape that grew progressively wilder with every passing hour. Farmland gave way to moorland. Moorland gave way to forest. Forest gave way to the jagged coastal terrain where the Blackthorn dynasty had planted its flag 3 centuries ago and dared the world to try pulling it out. Serafina arrived at the fortress on the evening of the 2nd day. The castle rose above the cliffs like something that had grown from the rock itself, its black stone towers catching the last light of a sun that seemed to retreat westward faster here, as though even celestial bodies felt the gravitational pull of Lucien Blackthorn's domain. The gates opened before her carriage reached them. Inside, the courtyard was organized with the efficiency of a military installation. Servants moved in coordinated patterns. Guards occupied positions that covered every angle and approach. Nothing was decorative. Everything served a purpose. Marcus Hale met her at the entrance. His Grace arrived 3 hours ago. He's in the command room and asks that you join him when you're ready. I'm ready now. Marcus studied her for a moment, and she saw something flicker across his face. Not suspicion, something closer to evaluation. The quiet assessment of a man who had spent 19 years managing proximity to power and had developed an instinct for recognizing which people survived that proximity and which were consumed by it. Follow me. The command room occupied the fortress's central tower, a circular space dominated by a massive table covered in maps, correspondence, and intelligence reports. Oil lamps burned at intervals along the walls, and the air smelled of candle wax, ink, and the particular staleness that accumulated in rooms where sleep was considered an unnecessary luxury. Lucien stood at the table with General Kane's latest dispatch spread before him. He had changed clothes since the capital. Dark coat, high collar, boots that looked like they had been made for the express purpose of walking across things that had been broken. His sleeves were rolled again. Serafina noticed the veins along his forearms, the taut cording of muscle that spoke of a physicality most nobles concealed beneath layers of tailored fabric. He looked up when she entered. Something passed between them. Not a word, not a gesture, a current. The atmospheric charge that builds between two forces approaching the same point from opposite directions. Kane has positioned his cavalry on the Ashenmere Heights. Voss's forward scouts were spotted this morning. 3 days. She moved to the table and looked at the map. Her eyes tracked the terrain with an understanding that surprised him. If Voss is smart, he'll send a detachment south through Greymore Pass to flank Kane's position. He's not smart. He's rich, angry, and convinced that numerical superiority compensates for tactical incompetence. Overconfident enemies are the most dangerous. They commit fully because they can't conceive of failure. He looked at her. Where did you learn to read military terrain? My father was a student of warfare. He believed that understanding how power was exercised by force was essential for anyone who wanted to exercise it through law. She traced a line along the river. The real vulnerability isn't the Western approach. It's here. The supply line from Ravenshade to Kane's position runs through 12 miles of open moorland. If Voss detaches even 500 men to raid the supply wagons, Kane's cavalry runs out of provisions in 6 days. Lucien stared at the map, then at her, then back at the map. She had identified in 30 seconds a vulnerability that his military council had discussed for an hour without resolution. Marcus. His steward appeared. He had been standing in the corridor. He was always standing somewhere. Send a rider to Kane. Reinforce the supply corridor with infantry from the Blackmoor garrison. 200 men minimum. I want armed escorts on every wagon between here and the heights. Marcus vanished. Lucien turned to Serafina. The distance between them had narrowed without either of them consciously moving. They stood on opposite sides of the map table, but the table had become less a barrier and more a shared surface, a common ground. You should rest. The next few days will require everything both of us have. I'll rest when the crisis is resolved. The crisis won't be resolved in days. This is the beginning of something that will take weeks, possibly months. If you burn out now, you're useless to me when it matters. Useless to you? The edge in her voice was slight but precise. A scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Lucien caught it, absorbed it, recalibrated. Useless to both of us. A pause. And to the outcome. She held his gaze for a beat longer than comfort allowed, then nodded and turned toward the door. Serafina. She stopped but did not turn around. What you did in the council, the legal challenge to Pembroke's proposal. He searched for words, and the search itself was so uncharacteristic that it carried more weight than whatever he eventually found. No one has fought for my interests without being paid to do it. No one in 20 years. She turned then. Her expression was complex, layered, impossible to reduce to a single emotion. I wasn't fighting for your interests. I was fighting for mine. They happened to align. She left the room. Lucien stood alone with the maps and the lamplight and the silence that followed her the way gravity follows mass. He pressed both hands flat against the table and leaned forward until his arms took the weight of his upper body. Every survival instinct he possessed, the ones that had kept him alive through betrayals, assassination attempts, and the slow institutional warfare of aristocratic politics, every one of those instincts was screaming the same warning. She was becoming necessary. Not useful. Not strategic. Necessary. The way oxygen was necessary. The way the foundation of a building was necessary. Something load-bearing. Something whose removal would cause structural collapse. And Lucien Blackthorne had spent his entire life engineering a world where nothing and no one was necessary except himself. The contradiction sat inside his chest like a blade turned sideways. Not cutting. Not yet. Just present. Waiting for the moment when breathing too deeply would drive it home. 3 floors below the command room, in a small chamber adjacent to the servants' quarters, a figure sat in darkness and composed a message by the light of a single candle. The cipher was complex, layers of substitution and transposition that would defeat any casual interception. The message was brief. I am inside Ravenshade. The Duke trusts me. The woman is here. Phase 3 can proceed on your signal. The figure folded the message, sealed it with unmarked wax, and placed it inside a hollow compartment in the heel of a riding boot. Then the candle was extinguished, and the darkness in the room became absolute. Somewhere above, Lucien Blackthorne was planning the defense of his empire, surrounded by maps and strategies, and the fierce certainty that he could see every threat coming. He could not see this one. It was already inside the walls. The rider arrived at Ravenshade 2 hours before dawn, his horse lathered and blowing, its legs trembling from a journey that should have taken twice as long. The message he carried was sealed with General Kane's personal signet, and the wax was still warm when Marcus Hale broke it open in the corridor outside the command room. He read it twice. Then he entered the room where Lucien had been working without sleep for 31 consecutive hours, stood at the edge of the map table, and waited until the Duke looked up. Kane engaged Voss's vanguard at the Ashenmere Narrows. Initial contact was favorable. Cavalry charged downhill and scattered the forward column. That's not why you look like that. Give me the rest. 6 hours after the engagement, a detachment of 800 men appeared on Kane's eastern flank. They didn't come from Voss's main force. They came from behind our own lines, from the Blackmore garrison. Lucien's hands went still on the map. Every process in his body seemed to pause simultaneously, the way a machine stops when something essential breaks inside the mechanism. Not gradually. Completely. The Blackmore garrison is ours. It was ours. Commander Holt surrendered the garrison to Covenant forces sometime in the last 48 hours. The men we pulled from Blackmore to reinforce the supply corridor were Holt's hand-picked loyalists. They turned on Kane's supply wagons at the same time the eastern detachment hit his flank. The information settled into Lucien's nervous system like poison absorbed through skin, not fast enough to cause immediate collapse, but deep enough that the damage was already irreversible before the symptoms surfaced. Commander Holt, a man who had served Ravenshade for 14 years, a man Lucien had promoted personally, a man who had stood in this very room 6 months ago and pledged his life to the defense of the duchy with the kind of earnest conviction that Lucien had mistaken for loyalty, because it so perfectly resembled the real thing. This was how empires actually fell, not from the outside, not from superior force or better strategy. They fell because the people standing closest to the foundation pulled the stones out one at a time, so quietly that the structure didn't know it was collapsing until the ceiling was already coming down. Kane's status. Alive. Retreating north with roughly 900 men. He's lost the heights, the supply corridor, and any hope of holding the western approach. Voss will have clear passage to the Ravenshade corridor within 2 days. Lucien pressed his knuckles into the table surface until the wood grain imprinted on his skin. The pressure was deliberate. Pain as an anchor. A technique he had learned at 17, standing over his father's body in this same castle, understanding for the first time that grief was a luxury and survival was a skill, and the distance between the two defined whether a man inherited power or was buried by it. Who else? Marcus hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but it contained entire volumes of information that neither man wanted to read. Crane's intelligence network has gone dark. 3 of his 5 operatives in the capital stopped reporting yesterday. The other 2 sent contradictory information that Crane believes was fed to them deliberately. He thinks the network has been compromised. Compromised or turned? At this point, the distinction is academic. Lucien straightened and walked to the window. Below, the fortress courtyard was dark except for the torches burning at the gate positions. Ravenshade at night looked like exactly what it was. A place built to withstand sieges. A monument to the principle that sufficient stone and sufficient will could resist anything the world threw at them, except the threats that were already inside. He thought about Commander Holt. 14 years. Hundreds of shared meals, strategy sessions, inspections, and the daily accumulation of proximity that human beings mistake for understanding. Lucien had looked at that man's face countless times and never once seen what was actually there. Not because the deception was extraordinary, but because trust, even the measured and conditional trust that Lucien practiced, created blind spots the size of entire human beings. "Wake Serafina," he said, "and assemble whoever is left that we can actually verify hasn't been bought." The meeting took place not in the command room but in Lucien's private study, a smaller space on the fortress's uppermost floor where the walls were lined with ledgers instead of maps, and the only furniture was a desk, 4 chairs, and a standing cabinet containing documents that could destabilize 3 governments if they ever reached the wrong hands. 4 people. That was what remained of an inner circle that had numbered 12 just 72 hours ago. Lucien, Marcus, Crane, and Serafina, who entered the room with sleep still fading from her eyes, but her posture carrying the rigid alertness of someone who had learned to go from unconscious to operational in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Lucien briefed them in flat, stripped sentences. No embellishment, no emotional shading. Facts delivered with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon describing the extent of damage before explaining what he intended to cut. When he finished, the silence in the room had the specific quality of air inside a sealed container. Compressed. Finite. Getting harder to breathe with every passing second. Crane spoke first. If my network is compromised, I can't verify anyone inside the castle. The Covenant's activation of Holt means they've had assets embedded in our operations for months, possibly years. We have to assume there are more. How many people currently inside Ravenshade have access to operational information? Seraphina's voice cut through the room like a blade, finding the gap in armor. Marcus answered, 47. Military officers, administrative staff, household servants with access to sensitive areas. Then 47 people are suspects, including everyone in this room. Crane's observation landed without inflection, but the implication detonated in every direction. Lucien looked at his intelligence chief. You're suggesting I can't trust my own inner circle. I'm suggesting that Commander Holt was your inner circle 3 days ago. The Covenant has demonstrated the ability to turn people we considered unassailable. If they can reach a garrison commander, they can reach anyone. They can't reach me. With respect, Your Grace, that's exactly what Holt would have said. The words hit Lucien somewhere below the ribs. Not because they were wrong, but because they articulated a truth he had been circling for hours without landing on. The architecture of his entire empire was built on the premise that he could identify trustworthy people and place them in positions where their trustworthiness served his interests. If that premise was flawed, if the very mechanism by which he evaluated loyalty was compromised, then the structure he had spent 20 years building was not a fortress. It was a trap, one he had constructed around himself with meticulous precision and absolute confidence. We verify everyone. Seraphina leaned forward. Not through loyalty tests or interrogation, through information isolation. Give each of the 47 a different piece of false intelligence. Something specific enough that if it reaches the Covenant, we can trace it back to exactly one source. Crane tilted his head. A canary trap. 47 canaries. If anyone sings, we know which cage it came from. Lucien studied her across the dim room. The lamplight carved her features into something that looked less like a noblewoman and more like a general. The transformation was not physical, it was cognitive. She had assessed a crisis that had paralyzed men with decades of military and intelligence experience and produced a viable countermeasure in under 90 seconds. Do it, Lucien said. Crane, design the false intelligence packages. Marcus, control the distribution. No one outside this room knows what we're doing. Timeline? We don't have one. Voss is 2 days from the corridor. The Crown's legal machinery is grinding forward, and somewhere inside these walls, someone is feeding our enemies everything they need to destroy us. He paused, drew a breath that was shallow enough to conceal the fact that his chest felt like it was being compressed by something far heavier than air. We find the traitor before the traitor finishes what they started. The canary trap was deployed within 6 hours. Crane designed 47 distinct intelligence packages, each containing a fabricated detail about Ravenshade's defensive preparations. A specific number of troops, a particular supply route, a strategic vulnerability that existed only on paper. Each package was delivered to a single individual through channels that appeared routine, a casual comment during a shift change, a document left visible on a desk, a conversation conducted just loudly enough to be overheard. Then they waited. Seraphina spent those hours in the fortress library, a vast room that occupied the entire 3rd floor of the South Tower. She was not reading for pleasure. She was building something, a comprehensive legal and financial counteroffensive against the Covenant's institutional attacks, assembled from Ravenshade's own records and the legal precedents she had memorized during months of fighting for her family's survival. Lucien found her there in the late afternoon, surrounded by open ledgers and legal texts, her hair falling loose from its usual severity, ink staining her fingers. She did not look up when he entered, not because she hadn't noticed, because she was mid-sentence in a document and finishing the thought took priority over acknowledging the most powerful man in the room. He waited. It was not something he did for anyone. When she finally looked up, her eyes carried the particular intensity of a mind operating at capacity. Not exhaustion, saturation. The Covenant's legal strategy has a structural flaw. They're using the Consolidated Trade Statutes as the basis for the treason charges, but those statutes contain a reciprocity clause that was added in 1871 and has never been invoked. It states that any duchy accused of economic treason has the right to audit the financial records of the accusing parties. Meaning that if we invoke the reciprocity clause, every noble house backing the covenant has to open their books. Every transaction, every debt, every hidden account. She pushed a document across the table toward him. And based on what I've found in your own intelligence files, at least 4 of those houses are engaged in financial activities that make your tariff policies look like a child's lemonade stand. Lucian picked up the document, scanned it. His expression underwent a subtle but unmistakable shift, the kind of recalibration that happens when a man discovers a weapon he didn't know existed sitting in his own armory. You found this in our files. Your intelligence chief collected the raw data. He just never assembled it in a legal framework. Financial intelligence without legal application is just gossip. Legal strategy without financial evidence is just theory. You need both. He set the document down and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the controlled intensity of the tower room, not the sharp calculation of the council chamber. Something more exposed than either. The look of a man being confronted with the realization that the thing he needed most was the thing he had spent his life refusing to accept he needed at all. You're building a counterattack. I'm building a weapon, one that doesn't require soldiers. We still need soldiers. Voss has 3,000 of them 2 days from our border. Soldiers stop armies, legal weapons stop institutions. You need both to survive this. The word survive hung in the air between them. It carried a weight that went beyond military strategy or legal maneuvering. Survival for Lucien had always been a solitary enterprise. The fundamental operating assumption of his entire existence was that he survived alone, by his own strength, his own intelligence, his own willingness to do whatever the moment required regardless of cost. And now, standing in his own library, watching a woman he had known for less than 2 weeks construct a strategy that complemented his own with the precision of interlocking gears, he felt that assumption cracking. Not breaking, cracking. The way ice cracks when weight is placed on it slowly enough that the fracture spreads before the surface gives way. I need to tell you something. His voice dropped below its usual register, lower, more private, the frequency reserved for truths that cost something to speak. When this started, when you walked into my council and moved that chair, I thought you were an asset, a tool, something I could acquire and deploy. That's how I think about people. It's how I've always thought about people. Instruments, resources, pieces on a board. Serafina's expression did not change. She waited, not with patience, which implied tolerance, with attention, which implied respect. I don't know how to think about you differently, and I'm starting to understand that if I don't learn, it will cost me more than this war. She was quiet for a long time. The library's silence wrapped around them both like something with weight and texture. Dust motes drifted through lamplight. Somewhere below, the castle's machinery of defense continued grinding forward, indifferent to the private revolution occurring 3 floors above. You don't need to think about me differently, she said finally. You need to think about yourself differently. The question isn't whether I'm an asset or a partner. The question is whether you're capable of accepting either one without needing to own it. Before he could respond, the study door burst open. Crane. His face was a landscape of controlled urgency, in his hand a folded message. The canary sang. Lucian's entire posture transformed. The private vulnerability of 30 seconds ago vanished so completely it might never have existed. Which one? Package 17, a fabricated report about a hidden weapons cache in the eastern cellars. It was delivered exclusively to one person through a conversation I staged in the servants' corridor this morning. Name. Crane's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular flatness of a man delivering news he wished he could retract. Marcus Hale. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a fatal height. Lucien did not move, did not breathe, did not blink. He stood perfectly still while the name of the man who had served him for 19 years, who had managed his household, his schedule, his secrets, his vulnerabilities, who had stood at his side through every crisis and purge and midnight reckoning that defined his reign, detonated inside his chest with the force of an explosion that produced no sound and left no visible damage but rearranged every internal structure it touched. 19 years, every private conversation, every strategic decision made in Marcus's presence, every moment of unguarded honesty that Lucien had permitted himself in the company of the one person he believed had earned it, all of it compromised, all of it collected, all of it delivered to men who were using it to engineer his destruction. Show me the evidence. Crane placed 3 items on the table. A decoded message intercepted by one of his remaining operatives outside the castle walls. A financial record showing payments to an offshore account matching Marcus's personal cipher. And a timeline that demonstrated, with mathematical precision, that every major intelligence failure Ravenshade had suffered in the past 2 years correlated with information Marcus had been uniquely positioned to access. Lucien examined each item. His hands were steady, his face was stone, but Serafina, standing 4 feet away, could see the micro-tremors along his jaw and the way his pupils had constricted to points so small they looked like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence that had been running for 2 decades. Where is he now? Main hall. He doesn't know we've identified him. Bring him here. Your Grace, if he realizes, bring him here, now. Crane left. The door closed. And for 30 seconds, Lucien and Serafina stood in silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped rotating and was waiting for permission to resume. Lucien? Don't. The single word came out fractured. Not broken. Fractured. The way bedrock fractures under pressure that exceeds its tolerance, producing cracks that are invisible from the surface but structurally catastrophic. She did not speak again. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had experienced her own version of this devastation, that there were moments when comfort was a form of violence, when the kindest thing another person could do was stand close enough to be present and far enough away to not be a witness. Marcus Hale entered the study with the quiet efficiency that had defined 19 years of exemplary service. His posture was composed. His expression was neutral. He showed no awareness that anything had changed between leaving this room 3 hours ago and returning to it now. You summoned me, Your Grace. Lucien was standing at the window with his back to the room. He did not turn around. Outside, the sun was setting behind the coastal cliffs, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood that reflected off the sea below like light off a knife. How long? Marcus's composure held, but something behind his eyes shifted. A microscopic adjustment, the kind of change that only someone who had studied that face for 2 decades could have detected. How long what, Your Grace? How long have you been selling my secrets to the people trying to destroy me? The room's temperature seemed to drop. Not metaphorically. The physical sensation of heat leaving the space, pulled out by the gravity of the accusation. Marcus was silent for 4 seconds, then 5, then 6. And in that silence, Lucien heard the answer more clearly than any words could have delivered it. Because an innocent man, falsely accused by someone he had served for 19 years, would not pause. He would react, deny, express shock. The pause was not the silence of a man processing a false accusation. It was the silence of a man calculating whether his cover was salvageable. I see. Marcus's voice changed. The deference evaporated. What remained underneath was something flatter, harder, a voice that had been waiting behind the mask for a very long time. The canary trap. Clever. Whose idea? Lucien turned from the window. His face was carved from something harder than stone, something geological, ancient and compressed and absolutely merciless. Mine. He would not give them the satisfaction of knowing it was Serafina's design. Let the Covenant believe he had conceived the trap himself. Let them recalculate based on the assumption that his capabilities exceeded what they had estimated. Let them be afraid. 19 years, Marcus. I want to understand what 19 years of service buys a man who plans to destroy everything he helped build. Marcus studied his former master with eyes that had shed their last pretense. What Lucien saw there was not guilt, not regret, not the tortured conflict of a man torn between loyalties. What he saw was clarity, the cold, clean clarity of someone who had made a decision years ago and had been living inside it ever since without the burden of ambivalence. You want to understand. That's always been your weakness, Lucy. You believe understanding is power. It's not. Understanding is just the story you tell yourself while the world does whatever it was going to do anyway. You haven't answered my question. Because the answer won't satisfy you. You want a reason, a grievance, something you can point to and say, that's where I lost him. That's the failure I need to correct. But there is no reason. Not one that fits inside your framework. Try me. Marcus leaned against the desk. The casual posture was deliberate, a final act of defiance from a man who understood that his physical freedom had approximately 4 minutes remaining. I joined the Covenant because the Covenant is going to win. Not today, not this month, but eventually. The system you've built, this empire of fear and control and personal loyalty, it's a dead architecture. It only works as long as you're alive and sharp and one step ahead of everyone else. The moment you slow down, the moment you trust the wrong person, the entire structure collapses. And I decided years ago that I'd rather be standing on the winning side of that collapse than buried under the rubble. So it was survival. Everything is survival. You taught me that. The sentence hit Lucian with the force of a truth he could not deflect because it came wrapped in his own philosophy, thrown back at him by the man who had absorbed it most completely. Every lesson he had ever given about the primacy of self-interest, every demonstration of the principle that loyalty was a transaction and trust was a calculated risk, every cold axiom about power and control that he had dispensed across 19 years of mentorship, Marcus had learned them all, learned them perfectly, and applied them with the exact ruthlessness that Lucian himself had modeled. This was not betrayal despite his teachings. It was betrayal because of them. "Take him," Lucian said. Crane's men entered from the corridor. Marcus did not resist. He allowed his hands to be bound with the composed dignity of a man who had known for years that this moment would eventually arrive and had made his peace with it long before the reality materialized. At the door, he stopped and turned back. "Lucian, you'll want to check the eastern cellars, not for the fabricated weapons cache, for the real one. I had 6 months of correspondence stored in a compartment behind the third wine rack. Names, dates, operational details for every phase of the Covenant's plan." He paused. "Consider it my resignation letter." The door closed behind him. Lucian stood in the center of the study, surrounded by the wreckage of 19 years of misplaced trust, and felt something inside his chest complete the fracture that had been spreading since Crane spoke the name. Not his heart. Hearts broke in stories. In reality, what broke was more structural than that. It was the load-bearing wall between who he had been and who he would have to become. The wall he had built out of the conviction that strength meant control, that power meant dominance, that survival meant never needing anyone enough that their loss could destroy you. Marcus had been right about one thing. The architecture was dead, not because it was weak, but because it was brittle. Built to withstand external force, but catastrophically vulnerable to internal rot. And the rot had been spreading for years, nourished by the very principles Lucian had considered his greatest strengths. Control had blinded him, dominance had isolated him, and the refusal to need anyone had ensured that when the betrayal came, it came from the one person he had allowed close enough to deliver a killing blow. Serafina stood at the far side of the room, watching him with eyes that did not flinch from the devastation they witnessed. She did not speak. She did not move toward him. She simply stood, present and unafraid, while the most powerful man in the kingdom confronted the ruins of everything he had believed about himself. Outside the window, darkness had swallowed the coast. The sea was invisible now, just sound and salt on the wind. And somewhere beyond the walls, Voss's army was 2 days from the corridor. The Crown's legal machinery was grinding toward seizure, and the Covenant's net was tightening around a fortress whose greatest defense had just been marched out of the study in chains. Lucian looked at the woman standing across the room. The woman who had built him a legal weapon while the people he trusted were building his coffin. The woman who had moved a chair in his council room and in doing so had moved something inside him that he had spent a lifetime pretending was immovable. "I don't know how to do this," he said. His voice was stripped of every defense, every layer, every carefully maintained fiction about invulnerability. What remained was raw, human, terrifying in its simplicity. "I don't know how to fight a war I can't win alone." Serafina crossed the room, slowly, not with the measured pace of a political strategist or the careful approach of someone managing a dangerous animal. With the steady, deliberate stride of a person who had decided to stand beside something that was falling and hold it up. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the lamplight reflected in her eyes like small fires burning in dark rooms. Then learn. 2 words. 2 syllables total. And in them, the complete demolition of 20 years of isolation, the obliteration of every axiom that had governed his existence, and the first fragile, terrifying outline of something he had never permitted himself to consider. That survival did not have to mean standing alone. That the walls designed to keep enemies out had also kept allies from getting close enough to matter. That the most dangerous act a man built entirely of control could ever commit was the act of letting someone in far enough to help carry the weight. Lucien Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenshade, commander of armies, architect of an empire built on fear, stood in the ruins of his own certainty and made the only choice the moment allowed. He reached for her hand, and the man who had never needed anyone discovered that the grip that met his was steady and warm and stronger than anything he had ever built alone. They found the compartment behind the third wine rack exactly where Marcus said it would be. 6 months of correspondence, 43 coded messages, a complete operational blueprint for the systematic destruction of Ravenshade, laid out with the meticulous precision of a man who understood bureaucracy the way surgeons understood anatomy, every cut planned, every incision calculated to sever something vital without killing the patient before the operation was complete. Lucien spread the decoded messages across the command room table at 3 a.m. while Crane worked through the cipher key Marcus had used, cross-referencing names, dates, and financial transfers that painted a picture so comprehensive it made the air in the room feel thinner. 12 members, Crane said. The Covenant's inner circle. Marchetti, Pembroke, Voss, Beaumont. 8 others, including 2 members of the Crown's Privy Council and the commander of the Royal Southern Fleet. The fleet. Admiral Harwick. He's been on Marchetti's payroll for 3 years. The fleet is currently positioned off the southern coast, ostensibly for training exercises. According to these messages, the exercises are cover for a naval blockade of Ravenshade's port. Phase 3. Lucien absorbed this. His body had not slept in over 40 hours, and the exhaustion had crossed the threshold where fatigue became something else entirely. A heightened state where the mind shed everything non-essential and operated on the stripped-down architecture of pure function. He could feel his heartbeat in his temples, steady and mechanical, a metronome counting time that was running out. Serafina sat across the table, reading the messages with the focused velocity of someone processing legal evidence under a deadline that did not care about human limitations. Her eyes moved across each page with the systematic precision that had dismantled Pembroke's proposal, but her hands, resting flat against the table surface, pressed down with a pressure that betrayed the calm her face maintained. The timeline, she said without looking up. Phase 3 was scheduled to begin after the legal seizure of Ravenshade's assets. They expected the warrant to neutralize your financial resources first, then the military assault, then the naval blockade, a 3-stage strangulation. But Marcus's exposure accelerated everything. They know we have their operational plan. Which means the phases collapse. They can't afford a sequential approach anymore. It all comes at once. Lucien looked at the map. The map he had studied 10,000 times, memorizing every contour and corridor and choke point, until the geography of his domain was imprinted on his nervous system like a second skeletal structure. For 20 years, this map had been a picture of strength. Ravenshade's position on the northern coast, flanked by mountains to the east and sea to the west, had always been its greatest defensive asset. Enemies approached through narrow corridors. Supply lines stretched thin. Siege warfare favored the defender, but that calculation assumed the defender's navy controlled the coast. With Harwick's fleet blocking the port, Ravenshade's seaward advantage became a cage. Mountains on one side, hostile water on the other, and Voss's army approaching through the only land corridor that remained. A trap. The same topology that had protected the Blackthorne dynasty for 3 centuries was about to become its coffin. Unless... Crane. The correspondence mentions Harwick's fleet positioning. Specific coordinates? Crane shuffled through the pages. Southern approach, Anchored off Widow's Point, 12 warships. The blockade line runs from the point to the Ashenmere Shoals. 12 warships covering 8 miles of coastline. Standard blockade formation. Overlapping fields of fire, no gaps. There's always a gap. Lucian's finger traced the coastline on the map, moving north from Widow's Point along the jagged edge of cliffs and inlets that defined Ravenshade's shore. He stopped at a notation so small it was barely visible, a curved line indicating a sea cave system that extended beneath the castle's foundations. The Blackthorn Passage. Crane leaned forward. That hasn't been navigable in decades. The tidal pattern shifted after the storms of 32. The entrance floods at anything above half tide. At half tide, there's a 4-hour window, 2 hours in, 2 hours out, enough to move light vessels through the cave system and into open water behind Harwick's blockade line. Move vessels to where? And carrying what? Lucian did not answer immediately. He was running calculations that involved variables no one else in the room possessed. Distances, timing, tidal charts he had memorized as a boy. When his father had taken him through the passage on a skiff during a spring tide and told him that every ruler needed an escape route that no one else knew existed. Not an escape route, a weapon. One his father had built into the castle's architecture centuries ago, and that every subsequent duke had maintained in secret, not because they expected to use it, but because the Blackthorn bloodline understood a truth that most powerful families eventually forgot. The moment you believe your position is unassailable is the moment your enemies have already found the angle you stopped watching. Seraphina, the reciprocity clause you found, the one that forces the Covenant's houses to open their financial records. I have the legal filing ready. It just needs to be submitted to the royal court. Can it be submitted remotely? By courier? Yes. Any licensed advocate can file on behalf of a duchy, but the court will try to delay processing. Beaumont controls the judicial calendar. Not if the filing arrives simultaneously with evidence of Beaumont's own involvement in the conspiracy. If the Lord Chancellor is publicly implicated, the court's emergency protocols require his immediate recusal. The next senior justice takes over. Justice Aldermere, who has no connection to the Covenant and a personal grudge against Marchetti dating back 15 years. Seraphina's eyes widened slightly, not with surprise, with recognition. She was watching Lucien assemble a counterattack from broken pieces, constructing strategy from wreckage the way some men built cathedrals from rubble, and the speed at which the architecture took shape revealed something about his mind that transcended mere intelligence. This was the cognitive equivalent of watching a wounded animal become more dangerous, not less. The elimination of options had not diminished his capacity. It had concentrated it, compressed it, turned it into something diamond-hard and absolutely lethal. You're going to fight the war on 2 fronts simultaneously, military and institutional, at the same time. 3 fronts, military on the Western Corridor, institutional through the courts, and economic through the Blackthorn Passage. What's going through the passage? Yen looked at her. In his eyes, the exhaustion and the intensity and the residual devastation of Marcus's betrayal had fused into something she had never seen in another human being. Not madness, not desperation. The terrifying clarity of a man who had been stripped of everything except the essential machinery of survival and discovered that the machinery, running alone, was more powerful than everything that had been built on top of it. Evidence. Every piece of financial intelligence we have on the Covenant's members. Transaction records, bribery payments, embezzlement trails. All of it loaded onto fast boats and delivered to every major news gazette, banking house, and foreign embassy along the southern coast. You're going to burn them publicly. I'm going to make it impossible for anyone to support them without being contaminated by association. The Covenant's power depends on institutional legitimacy. The moment their crimes become public knowledge, every ally they have becomes a liability. Every supporter becomes a suspect. The conspiracy doesn't die because we kill its members. It dies because we make membership toxic. The room was silent. Crane and Seraphina stared at Lucien with the expressions of people who had just watched someone rewrite the rules of a game while the game was still being played. This requires perfect timing, Crane said. The passage, the legal filing, the military defense. If any one element fails, then we lose everything. That's been true since midnight. The only thing that's changed is that now we know the shape of the threat, and we have 43 messages worth of ammunition our enemies don't know we possess. He braced both hands against the table and looked at each person in the room. 2 people. That was what remained. An intelligence chief whose network was in ruins, and a woman who had walked into his life 2 weeks ago and was now load-bearing the legal and strategic framework of his survival. We have 36 hours before Voss reaches the corridor and Harwick's fleet completes its positioning. In 36 hours, we either dismantle the most powerful conspiracy this kingdom has ever seen, or Ravenshade ceases to exist. He pushed off the table and straightened to his full height. The movement cost him something physical. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened and his shoulders absorbed the effort of verticality, like a structure accepting weight it was not certain it could bear. Get to work, Ochab. The next 30 hours blurred into a continuous stream of preparation that pushed every person inside Ravenshade to the outer limits of human function. General Kane, regrouped with his surviving cavalry and reinforced by every available soldier from the castle garrison, established a defensive line at the narrowest point of the western corridor. The position was not ideal. 700 men defending a passage that a force 4 times their size was about to pour through, but the terrain compressed the attackers into a frontage of barely 200 yards. And Kane had spent his career studying how smaller forces use geography to neutralize numerical disadvantage. He positioned his infantry in 3 staggered lines behind hastily constructed barricades of timber and stone. The cavalry held the flanks, ready to strike the enemy column's sides once it committed to the central approach. At the castle, Crane supervised the loading of evidence onto 3 light boats hidden in the sea caves beneath the fortress. The Blackthorn Passage was exactly as treacherous as he had feared. The entrance was a narrow fissure in the cliff face that disappeared entirely at high tide, and the tunnel beyond twisted through darkness so absolute that navigation required memorized landmarks, counted strokes, and a tolerance for claustrophobia that most sailors did not possess. The crews Crane selected were men who had grown up on Ravenshade's coast, who had navigated these waters since childhood, and who understood that the mission they were about to undertake would either save the duchy or drown them in a cave where their bodies would never be recovered. Serafino worked without stopping. The legal filing grew into a document of devastating precision, each page building on the last like bricks in a wall designed to crush the Covenant under the weight of its own corruption. She cross-referenced Marcus's correspondence with Ravenshade's intelligence files, constructing a narrative of conspiracy so detailed and so thoroughly documented that no court in the kingdom could dismiss it without implicating itself. At hour 22, Lucian found her slumped over the desk in the library, her pen still in her hand, her body having finally overridden her will and forced the shutdown her mind had been refusing to authorize. He stood over her for a moment, looking at the ink stains on her fingers and the dark circles beneath her eyes, and the document she had been writing when consciousness abandoned her. He removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was small and private, and entirely unlike anything he had done in 20 years of ruling through intimidation and control. His hand hesitated near her hair for a fraction of a second before withdrawing, not because he did not want the contact, because he understood for the first time that wanting something and taking it were not the same action, and that the distance between the two was the exact space where respect lived. He returned to the command room and continued working. Voss's army reached the western corridor at dawn on the second day. 3,000 men spread across the moorland like a dark stain, their banners catching the early light, their formation carrying the confident geometry of a force that believed it was arriving to collect a surrender rather than fight a battle. Lucien rode to the defensive line before sunrise. He had slept for 90 minutes in the past 50 hours, and his body had entered the state beyond exhaustion where physical sensation became abstract. He could feel the horse beneath him, the weight of the sword at his hip, the wind coming off the moors carrying the smell of wet grass and iron. But the sensations arrived at a remove, as though they belonged to someone standing nearby rather than to the man experiencing them. He understood this state. He had been in it before, during the crisis of his 23rd year when an assassination attempt had killed 2 of his guards and left him fighting alone in a corridor for 4 minutes that redefined his understanding of what a human body could sustain when the alternative to sustaining it was death. The body, stripped of options, did not weaken. It simplified. It became a machine running on fuel that existed below the level of food and sleep and rest, running on something older, something the civilized mind spent its entire existence trying to forget it possessed. Kane met him at the barricade line. The general's face was drawn, his uniform bearing the marks of 5 days in the field, but his eyes were clear and his voice steady. They'll probe first, test the defenses. When they find the corridor too narrow for a massed assault, they'll try to push through by weight. That's when it gets ugly. How long can you hold? 12 hours. Maybe 16 if they're stupid about it. After that, attrition takes over. We don't have the numbers for a prolonged engagement. You won't need prolonged. You need 12 hours. What happens in 12 hours? The world changes. Kane studied his duke's face. He had served Lucien for 9 years, long enough to recognize the moments when the man's strategic vision extended beyond the horizon of what anyone around him could see. This was one of those moments. Whatever Lucien had set in motion, it operated on a timeline that required the Western Corridor to hold for exactly long enough. 12 hours, Kane repeated. I can give you that. Lucien gripped the general's shoulder. A rare physical gesture from a man who used touch the way he used words, sparingly, deliberately, and always with purpose. Hold the line, Aldous, whatever it costs. Hold the line. He turned his horse and rode back toward the castle at a gallop that pushed the animal to its limits and produced in his own chest the rapid, arrhythmic pounding of a heart, operating under pressures it was never designed to sustain. The battle began at mid-morning. Voss sent his infantry forward in waves, each line crashing against Kane's barricades like surf against rock. The corridor funneled the attackers into a killing ground where Ravenshade's archers and crossbowmen unleashed volleys that turned the narrow passage into something out of a nightmare. Men fell. Men screamed. The ground became mud and worse than mud, and still the waves kept coming because Voss had 3,000 bodies to spend and did not care about the exchange rate as long as the final calculation came out in his favor. Kane held. His infantry fought behind barricades that trembled with each impact. His cavalry struck from the flanks in coordinated charges that disrupted the enemy formation just as momentum began to build. The corridor's geography did exactly what Lucien had predicted. It turned numbers from an advantage into a liability, forcing Voss's superior force into a compressed frontage where only a fraction could engage at any time. But attrition was mathematics, and mathematics did not negotiate. By noon, Kane had lost 140 men. By mid-afternoon, the number was 212. Each death reduced the defensive line's density. Each gap required survivors to cover more ground. The barricades, battered by 6 hours of continuous assault, were beginning to fail at their seams. At the castle, Lucien monitored the battle through riders who shuttled between the front and the fortress every 30 minutes. Each report was grimmer than the last. The corridor was holding, but the margin was razor-thin and shrinking. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the tide reached its lowest point. Lucien stood at the cliff's edge above the Blackthorn Passage and watched 3 boats slide through the fissure in the rock like shadows being born from stone. The crews navigated the cave system with the inherited knowledge of generations, emerging into open water behind Harwick's blockade line exactly as planned. 3 boats. Carrying enough documented evidence to destroy 12 of the kingdom's most powerful families, heading south at maximum speed toward every gazette, banking house, and embassy that could amplify the detonation. The fuse was lit. The explosion would follow in hours, and there was nothing the Covenant could do to stop it because they did not know the Blackthorn Passage existed, had never known, and would not learn of it until the evidence was already in the hands of people who could not be controlled, silenced, or bought. Lucien turned from the cliff and walked back into the castle where Serafina was waiting with the completed legal filing. 27 pages. Every name, every transaction, every thread of the conspiracy woven into a prosecutorial narrative that would survive any judicial challenge the Covenant could mount. "It's ready," she said. "Send it." A courier departed the castle through a mountain path that bypassed the western corridor entirely, carrying the filing in a sealed diplomatic pouch marked for the royal court. By the time it arrived, the evidence from the boats would already be spreading through the kingdom's information networks. The institutional and economic attacks would land simultaneously, creating a cascade that no amount of political power could contain. Now there was nothing left except the battle. Eat. The western corridor collapsed at 6 in the evening, not because Kane failed, because 3,000 men pushing against 700 for 9 continuous hours produced a mathematical certainty that no amount of courage could overcome. The third barricade line broke. Voss's infantry poured through the gap with the frenzied energy of men who had been dying all day and finally saw open ground ahead. Kane retreated, not in disorder, in the controlled fighting withdrawal of a professional soldier who understood that trading space for time was not defeat, but strategy. His remaining cavalry covered the retreat, and his infantry fell back toward the castle in a column that maintained cohesion despite exhaustion, casualties, and the knowledge that the fortress they were retreating to was the last position available. After that, there was nowhere else to go. Voss's army reached the castle perimeter at nightfall. They spread across the moorland surrounding the fortress, their campfires appearing one by one like constellations being assembled on the ground. 2,400 men, bloodied but intact, surrounding a castle defended by fewer than 500. Inside the fortress, Lucian stood in the grand hall where generations of Blackthorn dukes had received dignitaries, conducted trials, and made the decisions that shaped the northern territories for 3 centuries. The hall's stained glass windows, depicting scenes from the duchy's history, rattled in their frames as wind from the approaching storm hammered the castle's exterior. Rain had begun, heavy, relentless, turning the ground beyond the walls into a morass that would slow any assault but not stop it. Serafina stood beside him, not behind him, beside him. A positioning that every person in the hall registered and none questioned. "The boats are away," Crane reported. "The legal filing is in transit. Both should reach their targets by morning." And Voss? Preparing for a dawn assault. His engineers are constructing siege ladders. He expects to breach the walls within 6 hours of engagement. Lucian looked around the grand hall, at the soldiers standing at their posts with the quiet, set-jaw resolve of men who understood what tomorrow meant, at the servants who had refused to evacuate and instead taken up positions supporting the defenders, at Crane, whose intelligence network was destroyed but whose personal loyalty had survived every test the Covenant had devised, at Serafina, whose presence in this room, in this castle, in his life, had transformed the fundamental architecture of everything he understood about survival. "Open the gates." Every head in the hall turned. Crane's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Your Grace." "Open the gates. Send a rider to Voss under a flag of truce. Tell him the Duke of Ravenshade invites him to settle this in the Grand Hall, face to face, commander to commander." That's suicide. It's the one thing he won't expect. Lucian's voice carried the absolute calm of a man who had crossed the boundary between fear and its absence and discovered that on the far side of terror there existed a clarity so pure it felt almost like peace. Voss is a bully with an army. Bullies understand force. They understand numbers. What they don't understand is a man who opens his own gates when he's outnumbered 5-1. It will terrify him, and terrified men make mistakes. And if he simply marches his army through the open gates and takes the castle, then the evidence still reaches the coast, the legal filing still reaches the court, and the Covenant still burns. Ravenshade may fall, but the conspiracy dies with it. That's not a loss. That's an exchange rate I can live with. A pause. Or die with. Serafina stepped forward. Her hand found his arm. Not clutching, not desperate, firm, present. The contact of a person who had chosen to stand exactly where she was standing and would not be moved by anything short of the end of the world. "I'm going with you." "No." That wasn't a request. He looked at her. In the grand hall's flickering torchlight, with the storm slamming against the windows and an army gathered beyond the walls, her face held an expression that he recognized because he had seen it in his own reflection during every crisis that had defined his life. The expression of a person who had calculated the odds, accepted the cost, and decided that the outcome was worth whatever the universe intended to charge. "If we walk into that hall together," he said, "every enemy in the kingdom will know that you are my vulnerability. They will use you against me for the rest of whatever time we have. They'll try." She held his gaze. "Let them. The same words he had spoken to her in the tower room, the night the world began its collapse, returned to him now in the moment when everything converged. Lucien turned to Crane. "Open the gates." The order passed through the chain of command with the speed of a pulse traveling through a body. Bolts were drawn, chains released. The massive iron gates of Ravenshade Castle, closed against besieging forces for the first time in living memory, began to open. The sound they made was the sound of certainty ending and something unknown beginning. Rain poured through the widening gap. Beyond the gates, 2,000 campfires burned in the darkness. And somewhere out there, Duke Aldrich Voss was about to receive an invitation that would force him to choose between the safety of superior numbers and the terrifying prospect of facing Lucien Blackthorne in a room where numbers meant nothing. Lucien took Serafina's hand. Together, they walked toward the open gates, and the storm swallowed them both. The rain hit like something personal. Lucien and Serafina walked through the open gates of Ravenshade into a darkness split by 2,000 campfires and the intermittent crack of lightning that turned the moorland white for half a second at a time. Each flash revealed the army spread before them in terrible clarity: tents, horses, siege equipment, and the silhouettes of men who had been killing all day and would resume at dawn unless something fundamental changed in the next hour. The flag of truce went ahead, a single rider carrying a white banner that snapped in the wind like something alive and desperate to escape. They walked, side by side, through rain so heavy it plastered their clothes to their bodies and reduced visibility to 20 yards. The ground beneath their boots was churned earth and standing water. Every step sank slightly. Every step required the deliberate decision to take the next one. Lucien felt the rain on his face and thought about the nature of thresholds. Every life contained a handful of moments where the person walking forward and the person who would emerge on the other side were not the same individual. The body continued. The name persisted. But something essential underwent a transformation so complete that the before and after might as well belong to different human beings. He had crossed thresholds before. The night his father died, the first time he ordered a man's destruction. The moment Marcus's name had fallen from Crane's lips like a stone into a well with no bottom. This was another one. He could feel the crossing happening in real time. Each step through the mud carrying him further from the man who had ruled through isolation and closer to something he could not yet name, but could feel assembling itself inside his chest like a structure being built from the inside out. Serafina walked beside him without speaking. The silence between them was not empty. It was load-bearing, a shared quiet that contained everything they had not yet said and did not need to say because the act of walking together through an enemy army in a rainstorm communicated more than language was equipped to handle. Voss's command tent sat at the center of the encampment, a massive canvas structure illuminated from within by oil lamps that made it glow like a lantern dropped on a dark field. Guards flanked the entrance. Their faces, caught in firelight, displayed the particular confusion of soldiers confronted with a scenario their training had not prepared them for. The enemy Duke walking toward them, unarmed, accompanied by a woman. In the rain. The tent flap opened. Duke Aldrich Voss was a large man who had spent 53 years cultivating the impression that his size was a metaphor for his importance. Broad shoulders, thick neck, hands that looked like they had been designed for breaking things and had fulfilled that design frequently. He stood at the center of his command tent, surrounded by 4 senior officers and a table covered in maps and battle plans that were now, thanks to the open gates of Ravenshade, functionally irrelevant. His expression when Lucien entered was not what anyone expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Fear. Barely controlled, poorly concealed, and visible in the rapid movement of his eyes and the way his right hand kept drifting toward the sword at his hip and then pulling away, as though the weapon offered reassurance his mind could not sustain. Because Aldrich Voss had spent 6 months planning the destruction of a man he believed operated on predictable principles. Force met force. Threat met countermeasure. The game had rules, and those rules ensured that the player with superior resources eventually won. A man who opened his own gates did not fit inside those rules. A man who walked through an enemy camp in a rainstorm did not compute. And the inability to compute produced a cognitive paralysis that Voss was fighting against visibly, the way a man fights against a current that is pulling him somewhere he does not want to go. Blackthorne. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was manufactured, bolted on. This is unexpected. No, it isn't. Lucian stopped in the center of the tent, rain still streaming from his coat, his eyes fixed on Voss with an intensity that made the four officers take an involuntary step backward. You've been expecting this for 6 months. You just expected it to end differently. It will end with Ravenshade under new authority. That hasn't changed. Everything has changed. You just don't know it yet. Lucian reached inside his coat and produced a single document, folded, sealed with the Ravenshade crest. He placed it on the map table with the gentle precision of a man setting down something explosive. Open it. Voss looked at the document, looked at Lucien, looked at his officers, who provided no guidance because they had none to give. Then he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The tent went silent. What Voss held was a summary. 3 pages. Names, financial transactions, and operational details extracted from Marcus Hale's correspondence. Not the complete evidence. That was on boats heading south and in a legal filing heading to the royal court. But enough. Enough to demonstrate that every secret the Covenant believed it possessed was now in Lucien's hands. Enough to make clear that the conspiracy's entire infrastructure had been mapped, documented, and was currently in transit to every institution capable of turning that documentation into destruction. Voss read the first page. His face lost color in stages, like a sunset running in reverse. White replaced the ruddy confidence that had carried him through 6 months of plotting and a full day of battle. He read the second page. His hands began to tremble. The paper shook in his grip like a leaf in the wind that was battering the tent's canvas walls. He did not finish the third page. He set the document down and looked at Lucian with the expression of a man who has just been shown the exact dimensions of the grave he has been digging for himself. This can't be verified. It will be verified. By morning, every gazette along the southern coast will have the full package. Every banking house that holds your accounts. Every embassy with an interest in the kingdom's stability. And the royal court will have a legal filing naming every member of the Covenant, including the Lord Chancellor, supported by evidence obtained from your own internal communications. You're bluffing. I've never bluffed in my life. Bluffing requires uncertainty about follow-through. I have none. You know this. Voss stared at the document on the table. The silence in the tent had become something with mass and density, pressing against every person present with the physical insistence of deep water. What do you want? The question came out flat, defeated. The syntax of a man who had run out of moves and was now operating on the bare minimum mechanics of negotiation. Withdrawal, complete, immediate. Your forces march east before dawn, and they don't stop until they're behind your own borders. And the Covenant? The Covenant is already dead. It just hasn't stopped moving yet. By this time tomorrow, every member will be facing financial exposure, legal prosecution, and political annihilation. The only question is whether you're standing with them when the walls come down, or whether you've put enough distance between yourself and the wreckage to survive. If I withdraw, Marchetti and the others will be too busy defending themselves to care what you do. This is a limited time offer, Voss. Take it now or share their fate. I genuinely don't care which. The rain hammered the tent. Wind pressed the canvas walls inward, making the lamps flicker and shadows dance across faces that had gone rigid with the weight of consequences. Voss looked at his officers. Their expressions told him everything he needed to know. Not one of them would meet his eyes. Not one of them offered counsel or support. They had read the room the way soldiers read terrain, and the terrain told them that the man standing in the center of the tent, soaking wet and seemingly defenseless, had already won the battle that mattered. Get out! Voss's voice cracked on the second word. Get out of my tent. I'll have my answer within the hour. You'll have it now. Every minute of delay is a minute closer to dawn, and at dawn, the window closes. Voss's jaw worked. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The internal struggle was visible on his face like weather on a landscape, forces colliding, pressures building, the inevitable surrender to physics that no amount of will could override. We withdraw at first light. You withdraw now, tonight. I want your army moving east before midnight. That's impossible. We can't break camp in. You'll find a way. Motivated men always do. Lucian turned his back on Aldrich Voss. For the second time in this story, he turned his back on an enemy in a room full of armed men. But this time it was not a calculated insult. It was a dismissal. The gesture of a man who had already moved past the current moment and was living in the next one. He walked out of the tent. Serafina walked beside him. The rain had not lessened. If anything, it had intensified, as though the storm itself was determined to witness whatever was happening on the moor and required more rain to express its opinion. They walked back toward the open gates of Ravenshade in silence. Behind them, the sounds of a camp being broken apart began. Shouts, movement, the clatter of equipment being packed with the urgency of men who had received orders they did not understand but obeyed anyway, because the alternative had been made unthinkable by a man who had walked through a rainstorm carrying nothing but a piece of paper and the absolute conviction that it was enough. Serafina spoke first. You could have demanded more. Territory, reparations, his title. Demanding more would have given him reasons to fight instead of run. When a man is drowning, you don't negotiate the terms of the rescue. You throw him something to hold on to and let gravity do the rest. That's remarkably restrained for a man they call the ruthless Duke. Ruthlessness isn't about taking everything. It's about knowing exactly how much to take and stopping precisely there. Take too little and they don't respect you. Take too much and they'd rather die than comply. The margin between the two is where power actually lives. She looked at him. Rain ran down her face, and in the intermittent lightning, her features shifted between light and shadow, with a rhythm that made her look like two people occupying the same space, the woman who had arrived at Ravenshade seeking protection, and the woman who had just walked through an army beside a man she had chosen to stand with for reasons that transcended protection entirely. You've changed. I've adapted. There's a difference. No. You've changed. The man I met 2 weeks ago would not have opened those gates. He would have fought from behind the walls and let mathematics decide the outcome. You walked out because you understood that the old architecture was broken, and the only way to survive was to build something new in real time. He did not respond immediately. They passed through the open gates, and the sound of their footsteps changed from the sucking mud of the moorland to the solid stone of the castle courtyard. Guards watched from the walls. Servants peered from doorways. Every face carried the same question, and the answer walked past them in the form of two drenched figures moving through the rain with the unhurried stride of people who had just accomplished something that would take everyone else days to comprehend. I didn't change because I wanted to, he said finally. They had reached the entrance to the grand hall, and he stopped beneath the archway where the rain could not reach. Water pooled around their boots. Steam rose from their clothes in the relative warmth of the sheltered space. I changed because the alternative was extinction. Every structure I built, every principle I operated on, every wall I constructed around myself, all of it was designed for a world where the threats came from outside. And the moment the threat came from inside, from Marcus, from the foundation I trusted most completely, the entire architecture collapsed. He paused, looked at his hands. They were steady now, but the steadiness was different from the controlled stillness that had defined him for 20 years. It was earned instead of enforced. The calm of a man who had been through the worst thing and discovered on the other side that he was still standing. You told me to learn, in the study, after Marcus. You said learn, and I didn't understand what you meant. I thought you meant learn to trust people, learn to share power, learn to do the things that everyone tells powerful men they should do because it makes for better stories. What did I mean? You meant learn to survive being wrong. Learn that the foundations you built can crack and the world doesn't end. Learn that the man who walks out of the ruins doesn't have to be weaker than the man who built them. He just has to be different. Serafina reached up and touched the scar along his jawline. The first deliberate, unhurried contact between them that was not about strategy or crisis or the desperate mechanics of survival. Her fingers were cold from the rain. His skin was warm beneath them. He has to be brave enough to be different, she said. That's the part you're leaving out. The covenant collapsed in 9 days. The evidence reached the southern coast exactly as planned. 3 boats, operating behind Harwick's blockade line, delivered sealed packages to 14 destinations before the fleet even realized they had been bypassed. Within 48 hours, Every major gazette in the kingdom published accounts of the conspiracy. Banking houses froze accounts. Foreign embassies issued formal inquiries. The institutional legitimacy that had shielded the Covenant's members evaporated with the speed and totality of morning fog meeting sunlight. Marchetti was arrested on the fourth day. His townhouse was seized. His assets were frozen. The legal machinery he had spent years weaponizing against others now turned on him with the impartial efficiency of a system that did not care who it consumed, only that the documentation was in order. Pembroke fled the capital on the sixth day and was intercepted at the border by Crown officers acting under the emergency authority of Justice Aldermere, who had assumed judicial control after Beaumont's forced recusal. The Lord Chancellor himself was confined to his estate pending trial, his signature on the seizure warrant now serving as prosecution evidence rather than instrument of state power. Admiral Harwick withdrew his fleet on the eighth day after 3 of his captains mutinied rather than continue supporting a blockade that was now internationally condemned. The fleet returned to its home port in disorder, its commander facing charges that would end not only his career but his freedom. Voss reached his own borders on the third day and immediately began the process of distancing himself from every Covenant connection his legal team could identify. It would not save him entirely, but it would save him enough. Lucien had calculated that margin precisely, and the precision was itself a message. I could have taken everything. I chose to take exactly this much. Remember the difference. By the 9th day, the conspiracy that had threatened to destroy Ravenshade, fracture the kingdom, and reduce 6 generations of Blackthorn authority to historical footnote had been completely dismantled, not by military force, not by the traditional instruments of aristocratic warfare, but by information deployed with surgical accuracy and legal strategy executed with a precision that the kingdom's institutional apparatus had never before encountered. The kingdom learned a new lesson about power. It was not the man with the largest army who prevailed. It was the man who understood that armies, courts, markets, and information were all weapons, and that the leader who could wield all 4 simultaneously was not merely dangerous. He was unstoppable. 1 month later, the Grand Hall of Ravenshade was full, not with soldiers or conspirators or the desperate machinery of crisis, with light. Torches and candelabras burned at full capacity, and the stained glass windows, which had rattled in the storm on the night Lucien opened the gates, now filtered afternoon sunlight into fractured spectrums that painted the stone floors in colors the castle had not worn in years. The occasion was formal, but its substance was unprecedented. Lady Seraphina Vale stood before the assembled court of Ravenshade and received the restoration of her family's holdings. Every acre, every title, every legal right that had been stripped by the fraudulent claims of houses that no longer possessed the power or the standing to contest anything. But the restoration was not the moment the court would remember. The moment came after, when Lucien stood at the head of the hall and made an announcement that produced a silence so profound it seemed to alter the room's acoustic properties. Seraphina would serve as co-administrator of the Duchy of Ravenshade, not as wife, not as consort, not in any capacity that derived its authority from proximity to him. As an equal, with independent legal authority over the duchy's judicial, economic, and diplomatic functions. The court did not know how to react. This was not how power was shared in the kingdom. This was not how dukes operated. This was not how the world worked. But then, the world had changed 9 days ago, and most of the people in this room were still catching up. Seraphina accepted the position from a chair that sat at the same height as Lucien's. The detail was noticed. It was meant to be chatti. Mbokant. That evening, after the court had dispersed and the hall had emptied and the castle had settled into the particular quietness that follows institutional transformation, Lucien and Seraphina stood on the tower balcony where, a lifetime ago, he had watched Hargrove's delegation approach through freezing rain and felt nothing. He felt something now. The sea below was calm. The horizon held the last copper remnants of a sunset that was taking its time, spreading color across the water in layers that deepened as the light faded. Wind moved across the cliffs carrying salt and the faint sound of the village below the castle, where life continued in the ordinary rhythms that persisted regardless of what empires did above. Marcus sent a message from his confinement, Lucien said, through official channels, a formal request for clemency. And? I'm considering it. Serafina turned to look at him. The surprise in her expression was genuine, and its genuineness surprised her in turn. She had not expected to be surprised by Lucian Blackthorne anymore. He nearly destroyed everything you built. He did destroy it. What exists now is something different, something I couldn't have built if the old structure hadn't come down. He leaned against the stone railing and looked at the sea with the expression of a man examining a landscape he was seeing clearly for the first time, despite having looked at it every day for decades. I've been thinking about what strength actually means, not the version I performed for 20 years. The real thing. And? Strength isn't the ability to maintain control. Control is a cage. You build it around yourself and tell yourself it's a fortress, but the walls face inward. Every system I designed to protect me from the world also protected me from the possibility that the world might contain something worth being unprotected for. He turned to face her. The twilight softened his features, but his eyes retained the intensity that had defined him since the first moment she had sat in his council room and refused to accept a lower chair. Real strength is the capacity to be broken and choose to rebuild instead of retreat. To look at the ruins of everything you trusted and decide that the wreckage is material, not a grave. To understand that the man who emerges from the rubble doesn't have to replicate what fell. He can build something that the man who came before was too afraid to imagine. That's the most honest thing you've ever said. It's the most honest thing I've ever understood. She moved closer. The distance between them, which had started at the length of a council table and had narrowed through weeks of crisis and choice, and the slow dissolution of barriers that neither had built to withstand the specific frequency of the other, collapsed to nothing. I didn't come to Ravenshade looking for this, she said. Neither did I. That's because this wasn't something either of us could have looked for. You can't search for the thing that changes your fundamental operating assumptions. It finds you. Or it doesn't. And you don't get to choose the timing, or the method, or the cost. The cost was considerable. The cost is always considerable. That's how you know it's real. If it came cheap, it wouldn't be worth rebuilding around. Lucy reached for her hand. The gesture, which a month ago would have been impossible for a man who had weaponized touch and controlled every physical interaction with the calculated precision of a chess player, was simple now, unguarded. An open hand extended without conditions. She took it. They stood together on the balcony of a castle that had survived everything the world had thrown at it and emerged, not unchanged, but transformed. Below, the sea continued its ancient negotiation with the cliffs. Above, the first stars appeared in a sky that was clearing after weeks of storms. You know what happens now, he said. We govern. We govern differently. Differently scares people. Good. Comfortable people don't evolve, they calcify. And calcified institutions become exactly what the Covenant was. Brittle structures that look permanent until someone applies pressure to the right point. She leaned against him, not as an act of dependence, as an act of architecture, two structures leaning into each other at an angle that made both stronger than either could be alone. Lucienne. Yes. The man who opened those gates, the man who walked through the rain. He's better than the man who sat in the dark room and made people afraid. He's different. He's better. Accept it. He was quiet for a long time. The stars continued their gradual occupation of the sky. The wind continued its conversation with the stone. The world below continued its patient, indifferent turning. I'll try. You'll do more than try. You'll succeed because that's what you do. You just needed to aim the machinery at something other than destruction. He let out a breath, long, slow, the kind of exhale that releases not just air, but everything the air has been holding in place. Tension, control, the accumulated weight of 20 years spent believing that the only way to survive was to become the thing everyone feared. The breath left him, and what remained was lighter. Not weak, not diminished. Lighter. The way a building becomes lighter when you remove the scaffolding and discover that the structure stands on its own. From the balcony of Ravenshade, Duke Lucian Blackthorne looked out over the domain he had nearly lost and saw it not as territory to be controlled, but as something entrusted. Earned not through force, but through the willingness to be broken and the courage to rebuild from the fracture lines. The sea was dark now, the sky was full of stars, and the woman standing beside him, whose hand was still in his, whose intelligence and ferocity and refusal to be diminished had reached through every wall he had ever built and found the man behind them, was not going anywhere. He had been feared, he had been challenged, he had been betrayed by the person he trusted most, and survived the betrayal by becoming someone the old version of himself would not have recognized. And standing in the ruins of everything he had built, he had discovered that the ruins were not an ending. They were a foundation. The night deepened, the stars burned, and the Duke of Ravenshade, who had learned at the cost of everything that power shared is stronger than power hoarded, stood at the edge of his world with steady hands and clear eyes, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the hardest battle he had ever fought was not the one against his enemies, it was the one against himself. And he had won.